Hey guys, how you doing? It's Tom. In a 14-1 vote, the Senate Intelligence Committee has approved the Senate Intelligence Authorization Act, and in that, Section 623 declares WikiLeaks a non-hostile state actor. Now, if you recall, back in April of 2017, Mike Pompeo, during an interview, said that WikiLeaks resembled a non-hostile state actor. And they're doing this to justify taking action against Julian Assange and the publishing organization. And the reason they're doing this is that they're not afraid of WikiLeaks being a threat to national security. They're afraid of WikiLeaks exposing classified documents, including classified internal memos of corrupt politicians on the Democrat and Republican side of the aisle, and they're worried about WikiLeaks exposing them. You know, there is an illusion that the Republicans and the Democrats disagree on issues, right? They appear to disagree on everything, but in reality, the country always drives forward toward war and that type of thing. A great example is Obamacare, right? For 10 years, we heard from the Republican Party, oh, they were so against Obamacare. Obamacare is a tragedy for America. It's going to cripple us financially. All these things are true. It's a redistribution of wealth. It's just one of the greatest taxes on the middle class of America in modern history. All these things are true. But if we look back now, in hindsight, well, Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan ran against Barack Obama. Romneycare in New Hampshire was essentially the skeleton of what Obamacare would become. So Romney put through Romneycare, and then Paul Ryan was his vice presidential nominee. Well, when the Republicans finally got the House, the Senate, and the presidency, Paul Ryan put forth a bill that was essentially Obamacare light, right? I mean, all he did was, instead of the government giving subsidies for health care, he gave tax breaks, except the tax breaks in the bill, for the example would be, even if someone paid $5,000 in taxes for the year, well, they just reversed the subsidies. So the bill allowed $15,000 in tax breaks, quote unquote. So really, it was just another way of structuring a government subsidy. So he proposed basically Obamacare light. And John McCain, when there was some negotiation, a patriot like Rand Paul, who actually tries to stand up for what he says he stands up for, gets some changes put in the bill, and the Obamacare is finally going to be repealed after 10 years of the Republicans saying it would be. And who stops it? It comes one vote short. John McCain. Well, John McCain ran against Barack Obama in 2008. So you see that the people that actually ran for president against Obama, it's just choice is an illusion. These are the same people that have stopped the repeal and the replacement of Obamacare. So, yes, the Republicans and the Democrats always appear on the face to disagree, but in reality, they actually agree very much. So when you see them agreeing on something like WikiLeaks being a threat, because Republicans, Democrats, they all say it. Julian Assange should be killed. He should be arrested. He has committed treason. Okay. So anyway, they all agree that he should be taken out. And the reason for that, again, not being that they're worried about national security, they are worried about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks exposing corrupt politicians such as Hillary Clinton. If it wasn't for WikiLeaks, she would probably be our president, and the censorship that you're seeing now would be ramped up even further. So it's important to make this distinction. And the reason WikiLeaks is such a threat, earlier this week I did a report titled Operation Mockingbird, the CIA Control of the Media, and I strongly suggest you watch that report. And in that, I go over documentation from the Church Committee in the 1970s, and what that showed was the CIA in today's money has paid out adjusted for inflation, has paid out over $1 billion to journalists and news organizations. So the CIA essentially hijacked the American mainstream media, dating as far back, according to the Church Committee, as the 1950s, and the media became a propaganda arm of the American government. So presumably the CIA is still doing this today, and the mainstream media has become an echo chamber I've done a report on Amazon and the CIA, which I would strongly recommend you watch, which exposes that the CIA has a $600 million contract with Amazon, and then Jeff Bezos purchased the Washington Post, and the Washington Post pushes establishment politics, and Amazon doesn't get called out for its tax evasion policies, which I was able to expose something called Operation Goldcrest, which is a secret agreement that Amazon has with the government of Luxembourg in order to avoid paying taxes. And again, there's a report I did. If you click on my channel, you could scroll back down. CIA, Amazon, and the media exposed, which it outlines all of this, and you could even see the internal documentation where I clearly document how Amazon.com avoids paying taxes. So, needless to say, it's pretty clear that the CIA, the American government, have still infiltrated the American media, and the media is simply the propaganda arm of the American government. And Wikileaks is something that operates outside of that, because these same tax-exempt foundations, which put the head, for instance, the Rockefeller Foundation, which control the Council on Foreign Relations, and where the CIA directors and most of the people in our government come through, also control governments in other countries. They're international, they're globalist. Globalism is the problem. We need to get back toward nationalism, toward the state, and toward local government. We need to shrink government. So these same bodies, the CIA, these tax-exempt foundations, they control media all over the world. But WikiLeaks, because Julian Assange has proven to care about truth, he's given up his freedom for truth, he's been stuck in an embassy for 10 years, they can't control him, and he's exposing the corrupt things that governments are doing, and because of that, the Republicans and the Democrats agree he is a threat to the political establishment. So they're trying to take him out, and it's a very important distinguishing feature that we have to realize, that this isn't about some hostile state threat. You know, in the end of 2017, there was an amendment to NDAA, and what this amendment did was it gave the CIA authority to combat foreign propaganda. But of course, they're declaring anyone who goes against the political establishment as being a Russian agent. I'm sure they'll declare me as being a Russian agent. And then that allows them to say, oh, well, that's a state actor, and we could use propaganda back against them or even take further action. So understand that many of the things our government does are to protect themselves in the name of protecting the country. And then make the double distinction, which kind of proves my previous point, that the mainstream media doesn't report that this is happening. It's an assault on the First Amendment, right? I mean, the right to free speech is really designed to prevent the government from stopping free speech, but they find different ways to do that. And of course, one of the big ways they do it is through this media-controlled government propaganda. You know, if you read the book 1919, if you read the book Propaganda by Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud and the father of modern propaganda, he wrote this book in 1928, not 1919, you would see that when he discusses propaganda, he discusses breaking the masses into groups, kind of like different parts of the body with different cells. And then once you break people into groups, you're able to get very predictable reactions out of them. And the way they're doing this today in America is they are breaking us up by race relations. So you have the media nonstop saying white people are bad, white people are the reason for all your problems, and it's the oppressed versus the oppressors, right? It's the new Marxism. They used to push Marxism by the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, and now they push it by the oppressed versus the oppressors being anyone who is white, so therefore anyone who is white is evil and the reason for your problems, and the oppressed being minorities. And the reason they've done this is to create division in the country, and by creating division in the country, they can further censor conservatives and libertarians. So they've convinced young people who are more susceptible to race division, because they haven't been through as much, that the average white person on the street who has no power, very little power, is the reason for their problems. And then when you have people who tend to be white, conservatives and libertarians, although there are so many who are minorities, except people like Diamond and Silk, because for the simple reason that they are black, are censored on YouTube, and people of that ilk who are, for the Joy Villa, censored on YouTube, only because of the color of their skin, true discrimination. So you have these libertarian and conservative speakers, but the media has used racial division and has, in the eyes of many young people, made anyone who holds these views out to be hateful, to be less than human, and because of that, they've been able to mobilize groups like Antifa to use violence to shut down free speech of conservatives and libertarians, and they lump them in, saying anyone who holds these beliefs are a Nazi, which is ridiculous because the beliefs of a libertarian are the antithesis of the beliefs of a Nazi. The beliefs of a libertarian are individual freedom, freedom of speech, individual rights, limited state power, whereas the beliefs of a Nazi are all about collectivism, right? Everyone is just a cell of the state, and if they go against the state, they're not helping the greater good of the state, and therefore the state has the authority to use force against them. So this is the antithesis, this is the opposite of libertarian ideals, but the media inverts everything. So they mobilize young people, and they use them to use violence to shut down the free speech of conservatives and libertarians. And of course the mainstream media, which is trying to divide and conquer, props up Antifa as an anti-fascist movement, even though they're very well aware that Antifa is using the very tactics that fascists use for our fascist government. I mean, give it, trust me, we're not 1938 style Nazi fascism, but in terms of a partnership between industry and government, the news media is controlled by 5 or 6 corporations. There might have been a merger. So 90% of the media is all 5 corporations, and of course the corporations meet secretly. They're all members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group. So industry and government are very intertwined, and the suppression of opposition, the ADL is censoring speech on YouTube, controversial speech. Again, they're saying, oh, it's racist, when in reality it's anyone who exposes things like Operation Mockingbird. They're being exposed because they're going, and this is on the left and the right. Anyone who's exposing government corruption is being censored on YouTube. So they're rolling out this censorship, and they're using violence, and they're dividing the country across racial lines. And this goes back to Wikileaks being important. And again, we could see all week there are more examples of this, and I wrote a few down here of how they're dividing the country through race. ESPN removed game reporter Robert Lee from covering a football game this weekend simply because his name was Robert Lee. They didn't want that to quote-unquote trigger anyone. They're training people to see things only through race. Robert Lee is an Asian American, far from a white supremacist, and that's incredible discrimination to remove him from his position simply because of his name, the name he was given at birth. It's just as bad as judging people for the skin color they were born with. You know, because someone 150 years ago who were the same skin color as me did something terrible, which I condemn, which I would stand up for today hard, and I would take a hard stance against, but they enslaved someone 150 years ago and they had the same skin color as me. Well, in reality, my family didn't even come to America until the 1900s, so, but again, they don't care. It's all about getting people to be divided by race and only see things through skin color. So Robert Lee is removed, and they're training the public mind. And Charles Barkley speaks up against, I think he spoke up against the division in the country, and a mainstream news publication wrote an article that Charles Barkley, a successful African-American man, successful athlete, successful businessman post-career, successful news analyst, they declared him a white supremacist. Again, they're training people to see things only through race, and anyone who goes against the quote-unquote progressive mindset, which I would argue has become regressive, they're training people to see things only through race, must be a white supremacist. So Robert Lee, Asian news reporter, he's removed from his position. Charles Barkley, successful African-American man, a role model who should be applauded, is deemed a white supremacist. And then We have a story, Tennessee freshman class at their orientation is encouraged to think about their microaggression and their white privilege. Again, they're training the young mind to think white people are the oppressors, therefore we should be divided by race, and it's a divide and conquer strategy. And at Purdue and Stanford University, professors are setting up Antifa groups, and they're telling 18-year-olds these are anti-fascist groups, and they're not condemning the political violence that they're using against people, when in reality, if college campuses weren't actually indoctrination centers, if they were designed to promote free thought and intellectualism, they would promote people to, rather than use violence against others who they disagree with, even if that's a Nazi, who I completely condemn, but I don't promote violence. I will use my words to show why it's wrong to judge people by the color of their skin. As I'm doing now, I'm just saying that the political class is using a divide and conquer strategy, oppressed versus oppressor, teaching people that all white people are bad simply because of the color of their skin. Now, I've met many bad white people. Nazis, people who subscribe to that ideology, are very bad, and they should be condemned with words, and we can defeat them with our words, because with freedom of speech, the best ideas win. It's easy to show why it's wrong to judge someone by the color of their skin. This is what Martin Luther King promoted. But it's not right to use violence. So these college campuses are indoctrinating 18-year-olds to say anyone who thinks differently than the quote-unquote progressive, which is really regressive thought you're getting on college campuses, must be right-wing, must be KKK, must be Nazi. Don't hear them out. That's the thing. The indoctrination doesn't want them to have actual arguments, because they'll realize most of these conservatives and libertarians are not Nazis. They just stand for constitutional values, because that's what's being eroded here, the Constitution. So don't hear them out. Rather, use political violence to silence dissent, just as they actually do in fascism. So this is what's happening in our country. We're being divided along racial lines, oppressed versus the oppressor. It's this postmodernism mindset where they've replaced Marxism, because that was communism had so clearly failed. Because anytime you're redistributing wealth, what you're really doing is you're not equally redistributing wealth. You're creating an elite class of people, a very small elite class, who have been given the authority, the justification to use force to take what is someone else's. So to take through extreme taxation, right? That's essentially what communism is. So you tax someone at an extremely high rate. If they say no, the government uses force, authority, at gunpoint to take what a person has and lock them up in a jail cell, or to kill them, and then redistribute it amongst the people. And the problem with this is force, right? Force is immoral. The only way this system could work is anyone who goes against it must be imprisoned or killed by the government, and all their possessions must be confiscated. So the very nature of communism is immoral. That's why the correct direction for the country is liberty, is to get rid of taxation, because the very use of government force against someone who hasn't done anything to hurt anyone else is immoral. Taxation is theft. If we were on the street and it was me and you, and we did a business deal between the two of us, and a third party came over and pulled a gun on us and said, give us 40% of what you have, and we said no, and they beat us down, locked us in a cell, or just killed us, and then took what we had, that would be theft. But when the government does it, it's taxation. So because of this concept, communism is a massive failure. All it ever did was create, it said it was designed to create no class system, but all it did was create a huge bourgeoisie system. But the bourgeoisie system was anyone who was in the government, who would have tremendous amounts of money and power, and anyone who was proletariat, which became, there's no middle class in communism, it's just everyone's poor. And everyone has no rights and no freedom of speech. So Marxism failed, so now they push this postmodernism, which is the new Marxism, which is the oppressed versus the oppressors. And right now in America, they are pushing the idea that white people are the oppressors, and minorities are the oppressed. And that's not to say there hasn't been a great amount of historical injustice in America. There are, but a regressive policy of making up for the eras of America 50, 100 years ago, today, simply based on the color of people's skin, is the same type of regressive policy that they pushed back then, but back then they pushed they pushed propaganda that minorities were bad and white people were good. So they just reversed it. And the whole idea is that it's always been the government. It's a divide and conquer strategy, just as it was back then. They say, white people were the oppressors back then, but the only reason, even if that is true on its face, the only reason that was able to happen is because government was given the authority to push laws that stated that minorities were lesser people, which is hateful and wrong. And if I was around then, I would have stood up against that, as I'm standing up for the expansion of government power now. Because the only reason slavery was legal is because government declared, the Democratic Party, very interestingly enough, declared that a human being, because of their color of their skin, could be property. This is wrong. So the reason slavery was able to exist was the force of government. Government was always the reason for oppression. It always has been. The state is your enemy. People are not your enemy. Stop giving the government more authority. So I just wanted to point out what's happening in America today, because this stuff is very complex. This is deep state, tax-exempt foundation controlled propaganda. They use modern psychology against the masses, and they use our color of our skin to divide us when we should be uniting as a people against our true enemy. Because if you are black, if you are Spanish, I really do love you. I really do judge you by the color of your skin. I could say it with such sincerity. And if you're white, I judge you by the color of your skin too. So if you do judge people by the color of their skin, I will use my words, not political violence, to demonstrate why you are wrong. And if you use violence against me, I will use civil disobedience, as Martin Luther King did, as Gandhi did, to show that I am correct. Because if you are having violence used against you and you don't use that violence back, then you are showing the public that you are right. And I am not afraid of violence. If this country ever gets to the point, I am a great advocate of the Second Amendment. And if it ever gets to the point where it has to and we have to go to war against our government, I will yell at the top of a hill to pick up arms and to stand up for liberty. Because liberty is what we have to stand up for. So if you're out there, if you're listening, understand that none of my arguments are about judging you based on the color of your skin. I'm only asking you not to judge me based on the color of mine. Because what I'm trying to point out is that white people, black people, Spanish people, immigrants, Muslims, none of them are the enemy. The government has always been our enemy. And until we realize the only way we will gain freedom, no matter what color you are, no matter what socioeconomic background, no matter what religion you come from, even if that's no religion, it is only through limited government power, liberty, protection of the First Amendment. This is why I stand up for Wikileaks. Protection of free speech, protection of the Second Amendment, protection of the Third Amendment, protection of the Fourth Amendment, the right to privacy, which, by the way, a bill passed this week and signed by Trump, who I support him on some things, but he certainly expands government power. He certainly expands the spy state. So a bill passed this week allowing, and I'll get you the information on what the name of the bill, allowing unwarranted search and seizure of homes. These are basic Fourth Amendment rights, but of course, where are the politicians? Where are congressmen standing up for this? That's right, they're non-existent. Where's the media? Non-existent. So I implore you as a people to spread the message of liberty, to talk to people who disagree with you. And even if they're saying things you really disagree with, understand that they are being programmed, indoctrinated to think in a certain way. And we need to reverse this indoctrination, and the only way we can do it is through free speech, free thought, a return to small government, and a return to liberty. I'm Tom Anderson, FFRnews. Support grassroots media for as little as $1 a month at www.patreon.com. Tom Anderson.